Welcome back.
This is Two Beards and a Bible. I was caught unawares. All right. I'm John Swaino.
I'm Dave Teddy.
And we are picking up where we left off in 2 Corinthians. And we're still in chapter 1, and we left off at, let's see.
Verse 15.
Verse 15, yep.
I think it's my turn to read.
Okay.
I'm going to read this first passage. It goes all the way through the second verse in chapter 2. Paul says, and in this confidence, so what confidence he's talking about? I guess we should say that before. So the confidence he's talking about is that he's been doing everything in alignment with God's will.
Mm-hmm.
That's the confidence Paul has right now. Let's so in just to bring it into context. So he says, in this confidence, he says, I intended to come to you before that you might have a second benefit, to pass by way of you to Macedonia, to come again from Macedonia to you, and be helped by you on my way to Judea. Therefore, when I was planning this, did I do it lightly? Or the things I plan, do I plan according to the flesh? That with me there should be yes, yes, and no, no? But as God is faithful, our word to you was not yes or no. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who was preached among you by us, by me, Silvanus and Timothy, was not yes and no, but in him yes. For all the promises of God in him are yes, and in him, amen, to the glory of God through us. Now he who establishes us with you in Christ, and has anointed us as God, who also sealed us and given us the Spirit in our hearts as a guarantee. Moreover, I call God as a witness against my soul, that to spare you I came no more to Corinth. Not that we have dominion over your faith, but are fellow workers for your joy. For by faith you stand. But I determined this within myself, that I would not come again to you in sorrow. For if I make you sorrowful, then who is he who makes me glad, but the one who is made sorrowful by me? Okay. Some tongue twist. There's
a lot of yes no's in there.
There's some typical Paul writing here.
Right.
Right. which is above my intelligence level many times.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is he didn't, when he goes back here, therefore in verse 17, therefore when I was planning this, did I do it lightly? And he didn't come at that time. So, he's pointing out to them that he fully intended to come.
Yes.
And he's not one, and neither are those with him, those that would go against their word.
Yeah.
His yes is yes and his no is no. Yeah. But there's some reasoning as to why he didn't come. He was kind of giving them a chance to fix some things that were.
I believe that, and I believe, so he wrote the letter of the First Corinthians letter, and he writes it to him, and there is a lot of harsh things in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like what he's basically saying, he's saying, hey, I was gonna come, but rather than me coming, I'm going to give you guys a little time to get these things straightened out, so that when I come, it's going to be a happy thing. Because otherwise, if I came right now and there's still these problems, it's not going to, it's going to be sorrow.
Right. And you can see this. You can make the connection, with children. If you don't tell your child, clean your room, turn around, and 10 minutes later go in and start whipping them for not cleaning the room.
Yes.
He's giving them time and patience, and that's the Lord is not slack concerning his promises. He's desiring that everyone make amends and come to the knowledge of truth.
I like in there, he says, not that we have dominion over your faith, but our fellow workers for your joy, for by faith you stand. I think the idea is, if he was to come there and have to personally have dominion over them to straighten these things out.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's not putting trust in them.
Right.
Because he says by faith you stand. You're going to figure this out your own.
It's really not faith if you're being, you know, watched over and prodded to do the right thing. I think there's many people, sadly, even in the church today, that they're there because they go with grandma, because they go with dad or mom,
or I have to go because mom or dad's there.
right? And so they'll go, but it'd be preferable if they continued to go, even when they're not being watched, even when somebody's not there to make them go.
Yeah. I've seen there are people like when mom and dad are on vacation, the rest of the family's not nearly as punctual in their attendance to services.
Right.
No,
and I've had conversations with people, and this is I suppose a sticky, it can be a sticky subject, but when you have, let's say that you have somebody that they're always there if so and so gives them a ride, but then so and so is out of town, and let's be honest, this person has the means by which to get a ride, and to make a ride happen, whether it be by calling a cab or calling another friend or doing something,
right.
but no effort is put forth in that direction. That speaks to the faith.
Oh, it does.
Of that person, and that's kind of what, sort of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So Paul wants them to give them some time.
Yeah.
To figure out these problems and get them straightened out on their own.
Yeah.
And then when he comes, it's going to be an occasion of joy because these things have been straightened out.
Right.
Now, no doubt, we don't have them, but no doubt he probably sent them that letter.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably them or multiple people probably sent him letters back.
Right.
Right. And we kind of, as we read through 2 Corinthians, I think if you keep that in mind, maybe there's some communication that was going back to Paul that maybe we're not privy to.
Right.
And that's why maybe some of the things he says these things.
Right.
And in fact, this next section is kind of like that.
Yeah.
Because, he in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it details this man who has his father's wife, and Paul is very, very harsh about what he says about that. Of course, it needed to be said that way. And I think this next section here, which is on verse 3 through verse 11, I think this is addressing that situation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go ahead and...
Well, real quick,
yes.
Just throw a question out here for you.
Yeah.
As we read through this section, do you think it's fair to say that, when he says we, when Paul is using the word we as he's talking to these people, he's talking about, he and Timothy and the apostles.
I think so.
And, the you is speaking to the brethren there.
I think for sure he's talking about him and Timothy because in the beginning, it says it's from him and Timothy.
Keeping the context in mind, yeah.
Yeah.
And, when he says, who also has sealed us and given us the Spirit in our hearts,
is
a guarantee.
Yeah.
I think he's speaking and pointing back to them, not the brethren there.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's interesting also that he calls Timothy his brother.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, he'll call Titus his brother, but he doesn't call them apostle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
there's a distinction there,
right?
But yeah, I agree with you. This has got to be coming from him and Timothy.
Yeah, and that's just something to throw out there because I think it's important to keep that in mind as we read. It's easy to lose track of the context.
Yeah.
And this idea of sealing and so on. That's kind of a buzzword in the religious world because there are people that that claim to be sealed by the Holy Spirit
Okay, yeah.
and all sorts of things. It gets into a big discussion. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
You want to read through 11?
Sure. Yep. So starting at verse 3 in chapter 2. And I wrote this very thing to you, lest when I came I should have sorrow over those from whom I ought to have joy, having confidence in you all, that my joy is the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have so abundantly for you. But if anyone has caused grief, he has not grieved me, but all of you to some extent. Not to be too severe. This punishment which is inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man, so that on the contrary, you ought rather to forgive and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one be swallowed up with too much sorrow. Therefore I urge you to reaffirm your love to him. For to this end I also wrote, that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. Now, how far did you want me to go?
To 11.
11. Now whom you forgive anything, I also forgive. For if indeed I have forgiven anything, I have forgiven that one for your sakes in the presence of Christ, lest Satan should take advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices.
Okay, so he I think in the first couple of verses here, he talks about, he says, he continues on that thought about coming there in sorrow.
Mm-hmm.
But then he says, I wrote to you with many tears.
Right.
He says, for out of much affliction and anguish of heart, so probably before, he's receiving all of these letters, and that he addresses all these problems in First Corinthians. But writing First Corinthians was not a pleasurable experience for Paul at all.
Right.
It was a hard thing for him to write. And I think, anytime you've got to try to correct somebody, it can be gut wrenching.
Correct.
It's as bad for the person who did the wrong as for the person trying to correct it.
Yeah. And you can, again, this makes me think of parenthood so often.
Yes.
Because when you go to correct your child, and you leave and come back and you see them back into the same thing.
Yeah.
Or, to take another example from society, if you know anybody that's been taken over by drugs or some addiction, and you kind of help them to get to a certain place where they're squared away a little bit. And then when you come back, next time you go to see them, you're really hoping that they're still okay.
Yeah.
And that they haven't fallen back into whatever it was.
Right.
And sin has there's all kinds of parallels you can draw between, sin and those things, addiction and, parenting and so on, that we can kind of understand the feeling behind these words.
He says they didn't write those things so they would be grieved, he says, or upset.
Right.
He says he writes it because he's like, I did this to show you that I do love you, and this is upsetting me.
Right. Yeah, and that's again, love. I think in our society, especially, we tend to, or we have taught ourselves to believe that love is comfortable all the time.
Yeah.
And that it's just warm and smushy and wonderful.
Only people who haven't been married believe that.
Right. Right. So it is a much misunderstood emotion.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
And love is much more than emotion too.
Yeah.
It's
like that old classic rock song, "Love Hurts."
Right.
Verse 5. He says, "If anyone has caused grief, he has not grieved me, but all of you to some extent. Not to be severe," he says, "this punishment which was inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man." So is he saying that some people didn't want to do this? Or is he saying they took a vote? whether they should do what Paul told them to do?
Not that you might know the love which I have so abundantly for you. But if anyone has caused grief, he has not grieved me, but all of you to some extent, not to be too severe. Well, I'm taking away from that, at least. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I'm taking away from that, at least from the last part of verse 5 there. Uh, that if you have somebody among you, not to be too severe with them. Maybe there's a parallel here between what he was saying. He didn't want to come back and lord it over them and
Yeah.
find them to be in some error. But among themselves, as they fix these things, I'm kind of coming away with the idea that he's saying not to be too severe with them, but to be an encouragement
Yeah.
along the way as someone makes correction.
Yeah. So he says this punishment was inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man. So, and that's why we think it's probably talking about this guy who has his father's wife, because that's the individual man that was dealt with in the first letter.
Right.
So, what does he mean by the majority?
Well, there's some that didn't. Yeah.
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 So I think what's interesting about that is, and if you've ever dealt with any problem in a congregation, you'll know that not everybody agrees.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly not everybody's right.
Right.
Right? So
yeah. And that's one of the things that I think we should, when we're speaking of the brethren, speaking of getting along with one another, you're just not going to get a group of even 5 people together that is going to agree 100%. There's 5 people in my house, 4 people in your house. How often do you come across situations where not all 4 of you agree on where you're going to eat for the evening or what you're going to do?
Yeah, that happens, right?
Yeah, and so when we get into even weightier matters, the brethren, we are connected, and we are to love each other. We are to bear with one another, and sometimes we're not going to agree on every little thing, but we agree on the things that are commanded.
Yeah.
And where we have a brother that has fallen, we need to give them the opportunity to make things right. If we just come down on people and never let up, never let them forget about the issue that was, then there's never going to be any healing.
Right. The one thing also I think this indicates is that the majority of the people in that congregation understood that was a problem.
Yeah.
There were some that didn't.
Yeah.
But the majority understood, okay, this is a major problem.
And when we think of the church and the way that it has been set up, with elders and deacons and brethren, and I've witnessed times where a decision has been made, and I know that not everybody was in alignment or agreement with it, over some little thing, but thankfully I've seen most of the time where people understand that some decision had to be made, and while it might not be the one I would have made, I'm going to go ahead and continue forward with this, and that's the way that it's supposed to work. We're not supposed to hinder each other.
I know of a situation where there's a congregation where they had put up a TV in the back vestibule, and some people were upset by that. They said it looks too denominational.
Oh,
but and maybe it does to them,
right?
But there's nothing in of itself wrong with it. There's nothing scripturally wrong with what they did.
Right.
So I mean, it's like, okay, you gotta get past that one.
Right.
And some things are opinion.
Right.
Right, and that's one of them.
Right. And with some of the things that unfortunately I've heard, and this I think lines up a little bit more like with what we're talking about here. Someone has been involved in some sort of a sin, and they're now hopefully making amends, I've heard people that say amongst themselves, that so and so has already repented of that sin 5 times. Why are they, why can't they get this right?
Because they're
Because they're human,
yes.
right? Wouldn't it be nice to be as perfect as
You've never repeatedly suffered with any sin.
right?
You must never have repented of anything.
And those are, I think this is a good reminder of that we want to, in verse 7, so that on the contrary, you ought to rather to forgive and to comfort, lest perhaps such a one be swallowed up with too much sorrow.
Yeah.
Because if we punish too long, or don't let up and don't forgive and forget, then there's not going to be, there's no place for them to come back into the fold, because they'll just be alienated.
That's like, and I think it's lost on a lot of people today. What's the purpose of discipline?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it isn't to so, I spanked my kids,
Right.
But I didn't do it because I enjoyed it.
Right.
Right. That wasn't the reason I was spanking the kids.
Right.
I was trying to get them, I was trying to correct them.
Right.
And get them on the right path. Well, there's a time and a place for different types of punishment.
And, speaking of such things, there's absolutely a time with children where spanking works.
But it's the only thing, a 3-year-old, it's the only thing they understand.
When you can't reason.
You can't reason with a 3, even sometimes with a 5-year-old, you can't reason with them.
But at some point, you have to reach that point where you have to be able to reason with them, and you want them to be able to understand what is good, and you want them to desire to do what is good, not just because they're going to get a spanking, not just because of some physical punishment of some sort.
Right.
You want them to come around to be in alignment with the proper way of thinking, and that's biblical. That's what the Lord hopes for His people.
And certainly church discipline, which is what this is all talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That, and Paul's making the point here. He says, don't. He says, therefore, he says, reaffirm your love to Him.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, church discipline is to get someone, just like discipline kids, to get them back on the right path.
Yeah.
And that's what this is too. You can't just discipline them and let them go.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've been places. I think that personally, I think this is a great way to do it. But where someone perhaps had fallen away, they perhaps went forward and asked for prayers for a difficult time, a sin that they had repented of or something, and then after the service, everybody in the assembly lines up and hugs that person.
I've been part of that many times.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to do it. I think sometimes we forget to do that, and we just turn around and walk out the door, and we don't do anything to, as is pointed out here, to reaffirm our love for that person.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that, in the first letter, Paul's like, okay, you got to put this person out of the church because you can't have this dwelling in the church. But then after you put them out, you need to figure out how to get them straightened out and get them back.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an action too that needs to be taken up by the church.
Right.
And I think that's where sometimes
there has to be a door open.
Yes.
We think of the idea of shunning, and there are some groups like, for instance, the Amish. If someone is put out of the church in the Amish church and they are shunned, they are dead to those people. And while we have our instructions for discipline in the scriptures, if it gets to the point of making it a public issue in the assembly, and you have to mark that person, life doesn't go on as normal. Yeah. You don't sit down and you don't sit down and eat with that person and just pretend like nothing is wrong. But let's say that person is going to be a part of your life somehow. You live in the same town, you live in the same neighborhood. You know, you're going to talk to them. You're going to perhaps, you know, ask them if they've thought about their situation. Would you like to study and perhaps talk about your situation a little bit further? You know, not as a social call, but
Yeah.
you know, every time you see that person, it should be kind of an opportunity to remind them in a loving way. You know, can I be a help
Yeah.
to help you come back?
Yeah.
You know, rather than let's cross to the other side of the street, or let's make sure that we don't go over to that part of town because we might see them. You know, then you're just throwing them to the dogs.
I remember hearing, and I've heard of a couple congregations doing this. They'll go back through their attendance, like their membership list, and say, "Oh, we haven't seen so and so in 10 years.
Right.
Let's disfellowship them."
Right. Right.
And I've seen, I know of a couple of congregations who have done such things,
Mm-hmm.
and which is completely wrong to do that.
Yeah.
The reason is that those people aren't among you.
Right.
You don't have to disfellowship yourself. They did it already.
Right.
What you should do, instead of writing them a nasty letter, is you should reach out and try to set up a Bible study with them, or take them out to dinner or something.
Go see them.
Yes.
You know, at the very least, you know, and that's you know, if somebody has an issue with another brother, what do you do first? You go and see them.
Yes.
If that doesn't work, what do you do?
Yeah.
You take someone with you.
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, then you bring it to a public nature. You know, and that's biblical, and that's, you know, that's what we should be doing.
Yeah.
And probably it shouldn't get to the point where it's been 10 years since.
Oh,
you
exactly.
know, right?
You know, do we need to practice church discipline? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you know, there's some biblical examples of how it's done.
Right.
And we ought to stick with those rather than coming up, you know, oh, we're taking you out of the directory. Yes,
right.
I mean, some of this stuff is just, it's actually silly when you think about it. I mean, even we come up with things where we're like, well, you know, well, then you need to go forward.
Right.
Well, you don't need to do that. There's other ways you could make, you know, I've seen people like they'll write a letter and somebody will read it.
Yeah.
You know, or they'll write a letter and post it on the back. There's lots of ways to communicate things.
Well, and
do things.
You know, if the sin is public, then that's when you go forward and you need to make it known.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
If you have if there's a sin you're dealing with in your life, and it is of a private nature, and you're just requesting the prayers of the saints. You know, I heard somebody came forward one time at a place I was, and they had come forward and they had said that they're dealing with a sin in their life, and they wanted the prayers of the saints for strength that they might be able to deal with that. And I heard people afterwards saying, "But what was it? What was the sin? How am I supposed?
That doesn't matter.
How am I supposed to pray for it if I don't know what the sin is?"
Read the Psalms. Go home and read Psalms.
You know, you run the risk of being a gossiper then. You know, at that point. But you know, it's the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Right.
You know, why is it that we are supposed to discipline? It's not discipline for the sake of discipline. Right. It's discipline to change that person and bring them back.
That's what the purpose of it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. John, we better stop there.
Okay. Well, just as we were getting a little older. Anyway, we'll see you next time. I might have to hold it up there.
Good grief. It's not going to stop.
We're still here. Hello. Interesting. Push the bottom button.